creativity itself, I mean, I've always been someone who has gone into the creative, although I never really defined it as such until much later, until people sort of said to me, you're a really creative thinker, you know. My stance on that is that you can't do much without creative thinking. And that's creative thinking, not just in terms of, you know, art, music, that sort of creativity, although that is amazing stuff, but it's also in terms of what we tap into in terms of thought and behavior, and how we access that stuff in order to be innovative and progressive. And then there's the interesting culture, which is what's happening to creativity in our cultural climate, in our cultural landscape. And it's quite an interesting picture at the minute, and it's one that's a little bit concerning.
In your TED talk, you talk about this mass production. You know, I know that you are a creative person, you have a background in performing, and as you say, creativity is much broader than just the arts and the media and entertainment, as it were.
Yeah.
Why do you think that our culture at the moment, in your video, you said that there's only 0.1% direct investment by government into the creative industries? Why do you think that we have such a low level of interest in terms of, you know, investment in creativity and culture?
It's a great question. It's I don't know the entire answer to it from my perspective, which is all I can talk from, and also the bits of research that I've done. We seem to have a narrative right now which is very much about STEM, which is very much obviously science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and I think I have to be very careful with that, because it's great. Like, yes, we should invest in all of that, and we should invest in creativity. For me, it shouldn't be an either-or equation. And at the moment, it seems to be an either-or equation. There's some narrative or some belief, you know, out there, which is creativity seems frivolous somehow, or unnecessary, surplus to requirements. If we need to cut budgets, let's cut budgets around creativity, because the most essential things are STEM derived. And I don't know, I mean, I always go back to the Leonardo da Vinci quote, which is, you know, love the science in art and the art in science, because everything is completely linked. And I completely agree with that. I don't think we can have one without the other, and I think we'll run into problems if we do that, particularly around technology and AI, because we need creative thinking in order to excel with those things. And if we become too lazy around that, or we don't realize the value of creativity within those fields, then we're only going to be able to progress so far.
As you say, you know, the sciences and mathematics, all of it's interrelated. We can't really have innovation without creativity. In science being, you know, a huge amount of investment is put forward into innovation, but not into creativity. For me, that is a bit like investing in the harvest, but not in the seeds.
That's beautifully put. Absolutely, yeah. And not invest in creative education, which is like the new talent coming through, the new generations coming through aren't getting to be able to use their creative brain as much, because it's been slashed out of education. And that's terrifying for me. It's a lovely way to put it in terms of the seeds. I think that's right.
So in your work, how do you express creativity, and how do you encourage others to be creative?
My work, I think every day is creative for me. I work with businesses and individuals in terms of thinking differently and problem solving, and also in communication, and all of that. You need to think differently and move things around, and you can't do that without creative thinking. And that's all about repositioning messages and thinking differently to problem solve, and a load of other stuff. But I also work as a creative practitioner, and I'm a creative practitioner, so I play music and I write, and you know, all of that stuff. And I work with actors sometimes as well. So that's my world. In terms of my sort of championing of it, I guess I just alluded to it, in terms of if we aren't supplying people with the tools to creatively think and recognize what that is in terms of thinking and behavior, then we can't possibly expect them to deal with change or to innovate. So I kind of help people do that, where people are prepared to invest in it. Of course, often people aren't prepared to invest in it.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? That creativity does require a lot of risk taking, which requires, you know, who is going to take the risk. And do you find that in small businesses there is more of a reluctance to take the risk, because the margins are not there to cushion the blows if, if there's the experiments fail.
Yeah, definitely. There's that, and there's also the whole thing of people wanting to, which I guess we call in creative world the too smart too soon, when we're working around brainstorming and problem solving. But it happens in financial investment as well, where you might get HR or L&D or whoever is responsible for that financial pot, which I appreciate gets slashed down and can be limited. And the first thing they want to know is, if you're delivering creative thinking or innovation training, what's our return of investment going to be? And of course, you can't be absolute about that. You can tell them what's possible, but you can't tell them what's absolute. And then if they can't measure it, I mean, I'm going to quote Brené Brown here, if you can't measure it, in their world it doesn't exist, and it can't exist, and therefore they won't invest. So you end up in this really negative catch-22.
And a lot of the creative outcomes are, as you say, they're very, very difficult to measure because they are intangible.
Yeah.
So how do you come around that? How do you go?
That's I mean, I guess that sort of puts us into the development of creative wavelengths, which was the offshoot. After I did the TED talk in 2015, I was very aware that I diagnosed a problem, and I was also very aware that if you diagnose a problem, it's almost your responsibility then to find a solution, or at least find a way forward into what the solution might be. And also to combat the problem of how can you not be, how can things be intangible in creativity? Can we make them more tangible? And for me, I developed something called creative wavelengths, which is about how we can simplify a lot of the language and get more specific actually about the language we use around the creative process in order to create tangibility in something that people can grab in terms of concept, rather than it feeling like it's some sort of nebulous language, which has been a problem, I think, around creativity. We haven't had the right language.
Absolutely, because creativity, academics define creativity one way, entrepreneurs define it a different way. And what I notice is that there is this lack of clarity around what we mean by creativity, because some people will say, well, everyone's creative, and others will say, well, if everyone's creative, why use that term? The term loses meaning if we say everything and everyone is creative. Well, what is it that we're really talking about?
I would agree with both of those. I would say everyone is creative, but people are creative in different ways. And if we can articulate or identify the ways in which they're creative, then we can start to orchestrate teams or collaborations with people in terms of maximizing output or maximizing ROI, if you want to put that measure on it. If you can start to look at, well, that person is creative in this way, or that person's creative in that way, that person much more works insularly, this person is someone who improvises a lot, then you can start to pinpoint behaviors, and then it becomes possible. And it's completely possible to do that. We shy away from it generally for some reason.
Yeah, you touch on a really important point, that people are creative in different ways. We're not necessarily creative in everything. If we're kind of very good at art, we might not be as good at writing. We might be very, excellent storytellers, but we might not be, so creative in performing or in mathematics, because even mathematics can be very creative.
Mathematics is hugely creative and massively linked with music, in fact. The two sit together. I think it's Howard Gardner who links those two together in terms of brain space. Like, if you're mathematical, you're musical, mathematical.
Yes, yeah, Howard Gardner is, he did highlight this multiple intelligences thing and creativity. I think he's one of the researchers who's made it quite apparent that we have different skills. So it seems so obvious, but sometimes people forget what is most obvious. So when you're working with organizations and you're using your creative wavelength to provide some kind of tangible outcome, how do you do that?
It's the creative wavelengths, so there's 9 of them, and it varies how I use them, but often what it'll be a case of working out what's going on. So I use them initially as a diagnostic tool to get a group of people in the room, and that might be a small group or a larger group, and we talk about what's going on, and then I'll shorthand some of what's going on for them through the creative wavelengths and define them for them. That's a twofold thing. One, it gives them a shorthand to access and be able to talk about certain situations which otherwise they might not give themselves the permission to, or might feel like, oh, have I failed somehow? It stops it being personal. And the other thing is it's able to identify with them what they can do. So if something is, for example, in limina, which I call in limina, which is it's not what it once was, but it's not yet what it's going to be. It's in limina, comes from, like, derived from liminatic thinking. Then the permission to say, you know what, I'm holding that in limina, is really important for them, because otherwise people won't understand what's going on. People will make a lot of assumptions in an organization, for example, that they're being lazy or they don't know what to do or something else, where in actual fact you can use one term to just articulate, yes, I'm holding this here. And then also what that does is it manages the fact that creative thinking can sometimes happen very quickly, but sometimes it takes a little bit of time. You need to process. So things like that, it's introducing them to the language and then encouraging them to use it bit by bit by bit. So use it in a small way, and then I check back in with them, and then they use it in a bigger way. People have been able to troubleshoot some quite big issues through it and also move through them, which has been amazing, with relative ease as well.
Sometimes people can be very creative with one group of people,
yeah,
but very, not creative at all when they are put together in a different team with different people. So sometimes it's the combination
yes,
of
definitely.
the team members as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, it really can be. And sometimes that can be unpredictable as well. And sometimes we can't make any rational reason as to why that's happening. Sometimes you can, sometimes not. And in Creative Wavelengths, we talk about the concept, I think this is the real backbone of it actually, is the concept of orbit, which is who do you allow in to your creative space at any given time, and being conscious of that. So you don't have to necessarily be overt about it. You can be very discreet about it. But if you have the awareness yourself around, actually, if I'm around X, she sort of inhibits me somehow, or I don't feel like I can think very well around her. But actually, if I'm around this other person, then I can really come up with ideas. Then they can self-identify the best environment and the best space for them to maximize their creativity. So raising that as a thing and having it not be a personal thing, like, oh, they're really, they really hijack me, or they really crush my creative flow, but rather I just don't need them in my orbit, because whatever that catalyst is between us is or isn't working, is a really important concept for people to grab.
And sometimes in organizations it's difficult to put people together when it's obvious that there's chemistry between certain people and there's a lack of chemistry between others, but it can be quite difficult to shift them around because the organization is structured too rigidly.
Yeah, and that's something that I would always, with my clients, that I always question. I'm always saying to them, that's the structure and that might work for some things, that's great, but do you have to adhere to it so rigidly? Hierarchy, I guess it has its place, but it doesn't always work, and it's definitely not always conducive to creative thinking and innovation. So to be able to break that down, even if it's just for a half-hour group session or a half-hour team project thing, it is really, I think, imperative.
Do you think that organizations that have flatter hierarchies, that work more like networks rather than hierarchies, do you think that it's easier to be creative in those kind of looser structures?
I don't know if it's that simple. I would love to say yes, but the reality is down to how the communications work ultimately. Because I've definitely worked with organizations that have had quite strict hierarchy, but their communications have been very strong, and there've been permissions around those conversations where it hasn't inhibited creativity. And I've definitely worked across flatter structures where it's been great in terms of morale and rapport, but the braver conversations don't have the permission to exist because of that. So I don't know if it's as simple an answer as whether it's directly hierarchy related. I think there are other factors at play.
That's interesting, because I think, like, my gut instinct would be to say, yeah, flatter structures, networks, like more kind of chaotic relationships would produce more creativity. So it's interesting that in your experience that hasn't actually been the case.
Not always. I think chaotic, yes, but not all flatter structures are chaotic, and that's the thing. Some are, and some are on the side of caution, because rapport is so strong in there, and I'm all for rapport. I think it's a great thing, but when it stops us having the brave conversations or offering the risky idea, then that's not so great. we need to be aware of the dynamics of what's around us. So in terms of who, as I alluded to with orbit, you know, who do we bounce off well, who do we not bounce off well? Are there any particular environments where we work better? So that whole equation of where am I most creative, or where do I get my most effective ideas, or where am I feeling more free to have these conversations, I think is key. The other thing is to recognize creativity as not just one thing, but many things. And in which way is someone creative rather than are they creative or not? It's not a binary, it's a complete spectrum. And if we can start to have that conversation, we'd be able to access creativity and productivity in a much more effective way.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because you mentioned productivity now, and you know, although I'm trying to conclude this, I'm so interested in hearing what you have to say about the difference between being productive and being creative. So just would you care to say your perspective on that?
Yeah, of course. It's interesting because I'm working with a client at the moment who they are so creative. They are, you know, they're my dream client in terms of working with them in terms of creativity. But in terms of productivity, what I'm working with them on now is the fact that they are so divergent with their thinking. They have so many ideas and so many options and so much design, and it's great, but none of them can decide how to bring it back, to, you know, converge it back down and then drive it forward. So part of the creative process in terms of linking it to productivity is about being able to have that space to do the creative stuff, and also being able to pull it back and drive it forward and implement it in a strategic and practical way. Otherwise it will only ever stay ideas, and that's a problem. I think that's a problem for creativity as a whole, and it's also a problem for the concept of how people sometimes perceive creative thinking.